A flight attendant asked a black girl and her mother to give up their seats, despite paying extra. The cabin fell silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Then, a quiet man in a hoodie stood up and said a name that stopped the entire plane. What happened next changed lives forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sliding doors at LAX opened with a soft hiss as the morning light poured across the terminal floor. Amara Owens stepped forward like sunshine itself. 7 years old, full of wonder, she wore a bright yellow dress that sparkled slightly in the early light. Her braids bounced with every step, each one capped with tiny beads that clicked gently with her excited movement. In one hand, she carried a worn stuffed giraffe named Ginger. In the other, she held tight to her mother's hand. Talia Owens walked with a quiet strength beside her daughter. Her blazer was crisp, her dark jeans pressed, and her eyes sharp. Years of climbing the corporate ladder had taught her how to carry herself in spaces that weren't always built for women like her. She moved through the airport not with arrogance, but with certainty. She knew people would look. Some would smile with too much effort. Others would glance and then quickly look away. It had happened before. It would happen again. But Amara didn't notice. Her world was still full of possibilities. She skipped ahead a step, then twirled back toward her mother. "Do you think we'll fly through a rainbow, Mommy?" Talia smiled down at her. "If one shows up, Ginger better be ready." Amara giggled and held the giraffe up proudly. "She's always ready. She's brave." Talia gave her daughter's hand a gentle squeeze and continued toward the gate. Their flight to Washington, D.C. was scheduled for 9:05 IAM, Gate 42A. Talia had planned everything carefully. She'd booked row 10 for a reason. Close enough to the front for a quick departure, but not so close as to feel watched. She had paid the premium for those seats without hesitation, not for the legroom or the early boarding, for the dignity. A TSA agent scanned their boarding passes and offered a forced smile. It held too long, stretched just slightly too far. Talia nodded, politely accepting the gesture without reacting. Behind them, someone cleared their throat impatiently. Another passenger gave a half laugh under their breath. Amara didn't notice. She was too busy watching the planes taxi across the tarmac. "There's a big one," she whispered. Talia followed her gaze. A wide-jutty jet was pulling up to the gate next to theirs. The morning sun reflected off its silver body like a mirror. Amara pressed her hand to the glass. "It looks like it could eat the clouds." Talia knelt next to her and brushed a loose curl away from her daughter's cheek. "And soon you'll be flying through them." Amara grinned. "I hope we see one shaped like a castle, or maybe a giraffe. That'd be funny." Talia let herself smile for real this time. "Just, don't tell Ginger. She might get jealous." They laughed together, a moment untouched by the noise around them. It didn't matter that people were watching. For those few seconds, it was just them. And just a few rows behind them, watching silently from a lounge chair near the window, sat a man in a plain black hoodie and a soft gray cap. His eyes followed them, not in judgment, but with quiet curiosity. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But something about that little girl in the yellow dress caught his attention. It was Keanu Reeves, and no one noticed. The terminal buzzed with its usual hum, rolling luggage, boarding announcements, and soft conversations. Amara's yellow dress fluttered slightly as she skipped along the carpeted walkway, waving at each window they passed like she was greeting the clouds themselves. Talia pulled their rolling suitcase behind her and kept her pace even, graceful. She was aware of every glance cast in their direction. A few travelers offered warm smiles, genuine or otherwise, but others looked past them, around them, through them. Some didn't look at all. She was used to this. She'd spent her career in boardrooms filled with men who smiled just like that, performatively polite, always assuming they were smarter. Over the years, she'd learned not to shrink. She taught herself how to stand taller, speak clearer, and walk like the space belonged to her, even if no one else thought so. They arrived at gate 42A with 20 minutes before boarding. Talia set the suitcase down near the window seat and let Amara sit beside it. Across from them, two teenage boys were watching a video on one of their phones. The volume wasn't loud, but loud enough to catch Amara's attention. She looked over curiously but quickly turned her gaze back to the window. "Mommy," she whispered, "do you think Grandpa will look like the picture?" Talia turned from her phone, where she was checking emails, and smiled. "Maybe a little older, but his smile will be just like that." Amara nodded and hugged Ginger close. "I can't wait. I'm going to ask him about flying. Did he really fly a plane?" "Hell, did," Talia said, "a long time ago, and not just any plane. He was one of the first black pilots in the Air Force." Amara's eyes widened. "Like a superhero?" Talia chuckled. "Something like that." A woman in a navy blue uniform approached the gate counter and began calling boarding groups. Talia glanced at her ticket. Group 3, not first class, but priority boarding. She stood and guided Amara into the short line beginning to form. As they moved forward, Talia noticed a man a few steps behind them. Black hoodie, calm posture, cap low over his brow. She couldn't see his face clearly, but he looked familiar somehow. Not in a celebrity way, in a déjà vu kind of way. She made a mental note but didn't dwell on it. Her focus returned to Amara, whose excitement was practically humming through her little yellow shoes. When they reached the scanner, the agent smiled. "Ending to DC." Talia nodded. "Yes?" The agent scanned the passes and handed them back. "Have a nice flight, Ms. Owens." Talia caught the brief pause in his voice when he read the last name. It wasn't the first time someone hesitated like that, but again, she let it pass. There were bigger things ahead. She looked down at her daughter. "Ready?" Amara beamed. "I was born ready." They walked through the jet bridge, one small hand gripping one steady hand, yellow trailing behind them like sunlight. And behind them, Keanu Reeves followed in silence. The cool air of the jet bridge whispered around them as they stepped onto the plane. Amara gasped softly as she looked down the long aisle. "It's like a tunnel in the sky," she whispered. Talia guided her gently forward, nodding at the flight attendant near the door who gave them a quick, distracted smile. Their seats were easy to find. Row 10, window and middle. Talia lifted their carry-on into the overhead bin while Amara slipped into her seat and pressed her face against the oval window. "It's so big," she said quietly. "The world, I mean." Talia sat beside her, adjusting her tablet and reaching for the seatbelt. "It is, baby, and we're about to fly right over it." Across the aisle, passengers were still settling in. The overhead bins opened and closed with dull thuds. The cabin lights blinked once. Somewhere behind them, a child whined. Somewhere farther, someone sneezed. The ordinary sounds of a journey just beginning. Keanu slipped into his seat in row 11 and buckled in. He didn't pull out a phone or book. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his eyes naturally drawn to the pair in front of him. He couldn't explain why the girl in the yellow dress moved him. Maybe it was her joy. Maybe it was the way her mother carried herself. Or maybe it was something deeper. A memory. A name. Amara turned and peeked back at him. "Hi," she said simply. Keanu smiled. "Hi." Talia looked over her shoulder and nodded politely. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing final preparations for takeoff. The plane filled with the soft rustle of seatbelts clicking and tray tables being secured. Talia took a breath and looked at her daughter. "You okay?" Amara nodded. "Ginger's a little nervous, but I told her it's okay. You always keep us safe." Talia felt a small ache in her chest. She reached over and tucked a loose braid behind Amara's ear. "I always will." As the engines powered up and the cabin began to vibrate softly, the plane pushed back from the gate. Out the window, the ground slowly gave way to motion. The girl in the yellow dress leaned forward, eyes wide, as the plane began to taxi. Her world was full of wonder. And just behind her, the man in the hoodie sat still, watching the two in front of him. He didn't know their full story yet, but something told him this flight wasn't going to be ordinary. He didn't yet know that a name would be spoken mid-air that would stop his heart, or that a quiet act of courage would ripple across every soul on board. For now, he simply watched and waited, because sometimes history doesn't shout. It whispers and waits for someone to listen. The plane had finished taxiing, the engines were humming softly, and the final boarding call had long passed. The flight attendants moved down the aisle like they'd done it 100 times before, checking seat belts, helping stow carry-ons, closing overhead bins with practiced ease. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as the cabin settled into a low rhythm of quiet anticipation. Amara leaned against the window, her little fingers leaving foggy prints on the oval pane. "Do you think we'll see any dragons in the clouds, Mommy?" she whispered. Talia smiled, turning her head slightly from her tablet screen. "If you look closely enough, you might, but only if Ginger's watching too." Amara held up the giraffe with dramatic seriousness. "She never blinks. She's always ready." "Well, then you're definitely going to see something magical." Talia reached over and tightened Amara's seatbelt gently. Her hands moved with care, her voice warm, but behind her eyes, the fatigue of the past week sat like a stone. Conference calls, last-minute deadlines, meetings that dragged into late evenings. She had hoped this trip would be a moment to reset, to let her daughter meet a man whose name had always felt like legend, her grandfather. Keanu sat directly behind them in row 11. His seat was reclined just enough to give him a clear view of the two in front of him. He hadn't planned to engage, he rarely did on flights, but something about them had shifted the air. The child's curiosity, the mother's composure, the way they fit together, bright joy anchored by calm resilience. He leaned back, pulling the brim of his cap down slightly, but his eyes remained on the back of Talia's head. A click sounded from the aisle beside him, followed by a voice laced in forced politeness. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Talia looked up. A flight attendant stood beside her, blonde bun, sharp red lipstick, clipboard tucked under her arm. Her name tag read, Melissa. "Yes," Talia responded calmly. "I'm so sorry to bother you," Melissa began, her tone syrupy and soft. "But we've had a last-minute seating request, and we're hoping you and your daughter might be willing to assist." Talia raised an eyebrow, already hearing the tone beneath the request. "What kind of request?" "Well," Melissa said, shifting slightly on her feet, "there's a family on board with a medical situation. They're hoping to be seated closer to the laboratory, and row 10 is ideal for that." Talia kept her face still. "I'm sorry, but I chose these seats specifically and paid extra for them. I'd prefer to stay where we are." Melissa's smile flickered but held. "I completely understand, and we deeply appreciate your flexibility. But the family has a child with a special need, and they would be much more comfortable here." Amara looked up from Ginger, eyes bouncing between Melissa and her mother. Talia kept her voice even. "I understand that, but my daughter is 7. We're also a family, and we're already seated." Melissa paused. The clipboard held a little tighter. The air shifted. Melissa's smile thinned just slightly at the edges. She adjusted her posture, leaning in, as though trying to create an illusion of intimacy. "I know this is an unusual request," she said, "but these things come up last minute. We're asking for your cooperation just this once." Talia nodded slowly, folding her hands over her lap. "Is there a reason they can't take row 27? There's a pair of empty seats back there." Melissa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she offered a neutral shrug. "Row 27 is near the rear lavatory. This family specifically requested to be closer to the front for easier access." Talia's tone didn't rise, but her words sharpened slightly. "And I specifically requested row 10 for the same reasons. I planned this trip with my daughter for months. We're going to see her great-grandfather. He's not well. We chose these seats for a reason." Melissa inhaled slowly and tried a different tactic. "I completely understand," she said, adding another practiced smile. "But we want to make everyone comfortable, and if you could find it in your heart to assist, it would really help." That's when Talia saw them. Standing just behind Melissa, not far from the galley, was a white family of three. A tall man in a tailored navy blazer, a woman in beige heels holding a designer handbag, and a boy about Amara's age, dressed like he'd just come from a private school picture day. They weren't speaking, just standing, watching, as if waiting for something that already belonged to them. Talia's jaw clenched. Amara looked toward them, and then back at her mother. "Mommy? Are they coming to sit here?" Talia didn't answer. She reached down and took her daughter's hand. Melissa followed her gaze toward the family. Her voice softened just a bit more. "I know this feels unfair, but if you could just help this time, we'd be grateful." Talia turned her body slightly in the seat, angling herself toward Melissa. "Let me ask you something," she said carefully. "If they're such a priority, why not offer them the open first-class seats near the front lavatory?" Melissa blinked. It was quick, but noticeable. "Those seats are reserved for premium customers." Talia leaned back, lifting her boarding pass from the seat pocket and holding it out. "We are premium customers." Melissa looked at the ticket, then looked away just as quickly. The air grew heavier. Passengers nearby had gone still, pretending to read magazines, pausing mid-swipe on their phones, but listening. Talia held firm. "We're not moving." Amara leaned in again, her voice small but strong. "Mommy, is this like when the restaurant put us by the bathroom even though we had a reservation?" The silence that followed didn't just fall, it cracked. Talia didn't respond immediately. She stared ahead, expression unchanged, but inside something twisted. Amara's question had cut through everything. Past the performance, past the politeness. It had reached a place Melissa hadn't expected. From behind them, a sound broke the stillness. A soft scrape, leather against metal. Keanu Reeves stood up. It wasn't sudden. He didn't shout or make a scene. He simply rose, calm and deliberate, his posture loose but steady. The tension in the cabin thickened immediately. Melissa turned slightly, startled. Her smile faltered. She looked from Keanu to Talia, then back again. From the front of the cabin, another flight attendant approached. Older, firmer, her name tag read Patricia. She had the look of someone who'd spent decades managing everything from turbulence to tantrums. "Sir," Patricia said in a steady tone, "please return to your seat. We're resolving a small situation." Keanu didn't move. His voice, when it came, was soft. "No." One word. Quiet. Even, but it dropped like a stone into the center of the moment. Patricia blinked, thrown off by the tone. Not aggressive, but unwavering. "Sir, this is a crew matter." Keanu's eyes didn't go to her. They moved to Melissa first, then to the family standing beside the galley, then finally to Talia and Amara. He spoke again. "I'd like an explanation for why you're asking this mother and her daughter to move instead of anyone else on this plane." Melissa's mouth opened, but the words didn't follow. Her hand tightened on the clipboard. Patricia shifted, clearly aware now that this wasn't going away quietly. Talia turned slightly in her seat, surprised. She hadn't expected support, certainly not like this. Amara looked back at Keanu, her eyes wide. "Mommy," she whispered. "He looks like someone I saw in a movie." From the far end of the row, someone gasped. A low voice carried just enough. "That's Keanu Reeves." The name rolled through the cabin like a wave. Heads turned, eyes widened. Phones quietly rose from seatbacks. Screens lit up in trembling hands. Melissa stepped back. Patricia's jaw tightened. The family standing near the galley began to shift, their expressions hard to read now. Something between discomfort and retreat. Keanu reached into the inner pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a small, well-worn leather case. He opened it with a simple flip. The silver crest of North Stream Airlines glinted beneath the overhead light. "I'm not here as an actor," Keanu said. "I'm here as co-owner of this airline." A few passengers gasped audibly now. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. "And I'm also here," Keanu continued, looking down at Amara, then slowly raising his eyes to Talia, "as someone who owes a man named Robert Owens more than I can ever repay." Talia froze. She turned slowly in her seat. Her voice came out as a whisper. "You knew my grandfather?" Keanu met her gaze. "Saved my life." Melissa stood frozen for a moment, clipboard tight against her chest. Her carefully managed expression now wavered under the weight of dozens of eyes turned toward her. Keanu Reeves remained standing, calm, silent. The weight of his presence alone shifted the mood in the cabin. It wasn't just about celebrity anymore. It was something else. Something heavier. Patricia stepped forward, her voice lower now, as if trying to contain the unfolding scene. "Mr. Reeves, I assure you we're simply following protocol. The seating adjustment request was submitted prior to boarding." Keanu didn't budge. "That may be, but you're not answering the question. Why this woman? Why this child? Why them?" Patricia glanced toward Melissa, then toward the waiting family near the galley. The man in the blazer looked uneasy now, arms crossed. The woman with him shifted her weight in her heels. Their son stared down at the floor. Talia had turned fully in her seat. She kept her body between Amara and the growing tension in the aisle. Amara gripped Ginger tightly and looked up, confused. "Mommy," she whispered, "are we in trouble?" Talia reached for her daughter's hand, her voice low and steady. "No, baby, we're just fine." But inside, her heart was thudding in her chest. Not out of fear, not even anger, just a deep, exhausted ache. One she had carried for years. This wasn't new, it was just louder now. Melissa, voice brittle, tried again. "No one's accusing anyone of anything, we're just trying to accommodate." Keanu interrupted gently. "No, you're trying to make this quiet, to move them to the back and hope no one notices. But we noticed." Patricia's mouth opened, but before she could reply, a different voice entered the conversation. A tall man in a gray vest and navy tie stepped forward from the front of the cabin. His name tag read Dale. His walk was brisk, his eyes sharp. He spoke with a tone that indicated he was the ranking crew member on board. "Excuse me," Dale said. "I'm the cabin manager. Let me see what's going on." Melissa immediately stepped back, deferring to him with a subtle shift of her body. Dale turned to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, we weren't informed of your presence on this flight. I assure you, this isn't a targeted situation. We're simply responding to a request that came through operations." Keanu nodded slightly, and I'm asking again, why were they singled out? The family standing in the aisle wasn't even assigned these seats, and there are open options in the front cabin. Dale paused, searching for an answer that would smooth everything over. He didn't find one. Talia rose from her seat slowly. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She stood with the same quiet dignity that had gotten her through every closed door in her life. "You don't have to explain, Mr. Reeves," she said. "This happens more often than anyone likes to admit." She looked to Dale. "But today, I'm not moving." The cabin was no longer just watching. It was holding its breath. The passengers seated near row 10 remained still, some shifting uncomfortably, others frozen in silence. A few clutched their armrests. No one spoke. The quiet was loud in its own way. Even the overhead announcements seemed to fade, as if the aircraft itself was listening. Amara's small voice broke through the tension. "Mommy, is he helping us?" Talia looked down, meeting her daughter's eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, he's making sure we're treated fairly." Keanu stepped slightly forward, turning his body so he could see both Talia and Dale clearly. "I know what this looks like to you," he said, his voice calm but carrying an inconvenience, a misunderstanding, Maybe even just a poor decision made in the moment. He looked around the cabin. His eyes passed over the silent passengers, then returned to Dale. But to them, it's another day, another slight, another time they're told, politely and professionally, that their comfort comes second. Dale's jaw tightened. Melissa stepped forward as if to say something, but Dale held up a hand to stop her. "I appreciate your concern," Dale said to Keanu, "but this is an airline matter. We'll handle it." Keanu raised his chin slightly. "And I'm co-owner of this airline." Gasps rippled through the cabin again. A few passengers sat up straighter. Someone near the back muttered, "No way." Dale blinked. "I wasn't aware." "I didn't come here to be recognized," Keanu said. "But I also didn't come here to stay quiet when something isn't right." He turned back to Talia. "If you'll allow it, I'd like to stay here and make sure no one bothers you again." Talia stared at him. This man she'd only seen on screens. This man who had quietly stepped between her daughter and a decision made without care. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't shout. But something about him radiated protection. She nodded once. "Thank you." Melissa finally found her voice. "I really didn't know." "That's the point," Keanu said, turning his gaze on her. "You didn't know. And you didn't ask. You made an assumption. And that's the difference between service and silence." The family, still standing by the galley, began to move backward. Quietly, awkwardly. They didn't protest. They didn't argue. The man in the blazer gave Dale a small nod and gestured for his wife and son to follow. Dale exhaled and turned back to Melissa. "We're done here. Go check the aft galley." Melissa hesitated, then walked away stiffly, her shoulders rigid. The moment lingered like smoke. And then, slowly, seatbelt clicks resumed. Tablets lit back up. Whispered conversations reignited. But no one would forget what they had just seen. Talia sat down again, her movements slow, controlled. Amara leaned against her, clutching Ginger so tight the seams stretched. She hadn't cried, but her little brow furrowed in a way that broke something inside her mother. Keanu remained standing for a moment longer, then quietly lowered himself into his seat behind them. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The energy around row 10 had shifted. Not in anger, not in outrage, but in reverence. A line had been drawn, and for once, someone had stood on the right side of it before it was too late. A man across the aisle, in a plaid shirt and glasses, leaned over slightly toward Keanu. "I just wanted to say," he said softly, "that was the right thing. Thank you." Keanu nodded without turning his head. Another woman, 2 rows up, typed quickly on her phone, the reflection of her screen showing Keanu's name mid-sentence. A man behind her whispered something, but his voice was lost in the hum of the plane. Talia turned back slightly. "I didn't get to say it properly. Thank you, Mr. Reeves." He smiled faintly. "Just Keanu. And you don't owe me anything. You knew my grandfather," she said. Keanu looked at her for a moment, his face quiet. Colonel Robert Owens. Years ago. He'd pulled strings no one else could. Got me out of a situation I wasn't supposed to survive. Talia blinked and never talked about that. Who dared insist? "Wouldn't," Keanu said gently. "But I've remembered every day since." Amara looked back between the seats. "Are you really the airplane boss?" Keanu chuckled softly. "In a way, yes." Amara beamed. "Then can you make sure we get cookies?" That broke the tension in a way nothing else could. Talia laughed. A real one, for the first time in what felt like hours. Even Patricia, who had remained stone-faced near the front, cracked a smile before walking back up the aisle. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "I'll see what I can do." Talia leaned toward him. "She's meeting her great-grandfather for the first time. He's not well, but he asked to see her. Said he had one last story to tell." Keanu nodded slowly. "I'd be honored to meet him, if that's all right." Talia studied him for a second. "It is." The plane finally began to taxi toward the runway. Overhead, the fastened seatbelt light blinked steadily. The engine's rumble grew louder. The weight of the moment didn't vanish, it simply settled, like a truth finally spoken aloud. As the wheels lifted off the ground and the cabin gently rose into the sky, Amara pressed her nose back to the window. "Mommy," she whispered. "I think I saw a dragon." Talia rested her head back. "So did I, baby." Dale stood still at the center of the aisle, shoulders squared, trying to keep his voice composed. "Mr. Reeves, with all due respect, we don't want to escalate the situation." Keanu remained seated now, hands resting calmly on the armrests of his seat in row 11. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the thick air around them. "I'm not escalating anything. I'm asking for accountability." The tension didn't rise with shouting. It built quietly, second by second, word by word, like something just beneath the surface of calm. Waiting. Melissa hovered nearby, her arms now folded behind her back, clipboard clutched like a shield. Her earlier confidence had drained to something brittle. Dale exhaled and tried to hold his ground. "We're trying to maintain fairness and comfort for all passengers. These types of decisions are never personal." Keanu reached into the inner lining of his hoodie and pulled out a small, worn leather credential case. He didn't throw it. He didn't flash it for show. He opened it with a quiet ease, holding it where Dale and Melissa could see. The crest of North Stream Airlines caught the cabin lights and shimmered faintly, silver embossed. Official. Gasps echoed softly through the aisle. Someone whispered 3 rows back, "Is that real?" A man in a suit near row 6 leaned out of his seat to look, then quickly leaned back in, eyes wide. Dale's voice faltered just slightly. "You're a co-owner?" Keanu nodded once. "I am." He paused, and the silence waited. "And I'm also here," he said, turning toward Amara, "because of her." The little girl blinked up at him, surprised. "This little girl," Keanu continued, "is the granddaughter of Colonel Robert Owens." His words fell like thunder after still air. The kind of name that carried more than just rank. It carried history. Talia turned sharply, a breath catching in her throat. Her expression shifted from shock to something else, something deeper, more fragile. "How do you know my grandfather?" she asked, voice soft, almost not there. Keanu looked at her and didn't glance away. "You saved my life." There was no drama in how he said it, no swell of music, just... The cabin went still. Not just quiet, still. Every flicker of movement stopped. Every sound vanished. The shuffling of magazines, the beeps of phones, the quiet coughs and background buzz of conversation, gone. Melissa took a slow step back. Even Dale didn't move. He looked between Keanu and Talia, trying to make sense of something that had clearly passed far beyond his control. Keanu spoke again. "It was more than a decade ago. I was in a remote area of Chad on a humanitarian visit. There was a sudden outbreak. Conflict zones were closing around the town I was in. No flights, no exit." Talia listened, frozen. "I was stuck. No one could get me out. The embassy wasn't responding. The press didn't know I was there. But someone made a call to Colonel Owens." He looked back at Amara, and he answered. Talia's hand had moved to her mouth without her realizing. Her fingers trembled just slightly as they rested against her lips. She had grown up hearing bits and pieces about her grandfather's military service. The medals, the framed photos, the books. But he rarely spoke about specific missions. He certainly never mentioned this. Keanu continued, his tone as steady as before. "I didn't know who he was at first. All I knew was that someone had intervened. A small aircraft arrived. It wasn't official, it wasn't flashy, but it was fast. They flew me out at night under radar, quiet, precise, safe." His eyes dropped to the floor for a second as if revisiting the memory. "It wasn't until years later that I found out who arranged it. Your grandfather had retired from active service, but he still had friends in the right places. He didn't owe me anything. But he made it happen. Talia felt her throat tighten. Never told us. Keanu gave a small nod. It didn't seem like the kind of man who needed to talk about saving people. He just did it. He looked back toward Dale and Melissa. So when I saw the name Owens on the boarding pass, I wasn't sure. And then she mentioned him. He nodded gently toward Amara. And that's when I knew. Melissa had retreated 2 steps, now visibly uncomfortable. Patricia returned from the front of the cabin, her earlier sharpness replaced with a wary respect. She stopped beside Dale but said nothing. Keanu turned back to the crew. This isn't about special treatment. It's not about who's famous or who owns what. He gestured toward Amara. It's about knowing when something isn't right and refusing to let it slide. The man in the navy blazer from the waiting family stood frozen a few rows behind, his posture no longer confident. He reached for his wife's hand, trying to quietly retreat. The boy with them looked down, face red. Passengers had stopped pretending to ignore the scene. Some openly recorded. Others simply watched with stunned faces, absorbing what they'd just heard. Talia leaned back in her seat. She was still gripping Amara's hand. Amara whispered, "Mommy, Grandpa really saved people?" Talia nodded slowly. "More than we knew." Keanu looked back to the front. "I suggest we leave them in their seats. They paid for them. They deserve them." He looked at Melissa one final time. "And if that's not acceptable to the crew, then I'll take the next flight. But she's not going anywhere." Patricia glanced toward Dale, then back to Melissa. "We understand, Mr. Reeves," she said. "No one's moving." Melissa swallowed and gave a stiff nod. Without a word, she turned and walked back toward the galley. The clipboard now hung limp at her side. The air didn't relax, not yet. But something in it changed. Like a window had opened in a room that had gone stale. Fresh air had entered, and everyone could feel it. Dale cleared his throat. "We apologize for the misunderstanding." Keanu gave him a nod, but said nothing more. He didn't need to. Talia glanced at him, then reached up and adjusted Amara's seatbelt. Her hand brushed lightly over her daughter's shoulder. Amara leaned into her touch and smiled up at her, then peeked back toward Keanu. "You're really not an actor on this plane?" Keanu smiled. "Just a passenger like you." Amara nodded seriously. "Passengers help each other. That's what Grandpa says." Talia looked at her daughter, startled. "Helen told you that?" Amara nodded. "Said you don't wait for people to be kind, you choose to be brave first." Talia blinked. That sounded exactly like her father. The quiet lessons that never needed lectures. Patricia returned a moment later, carrying 2 cups. "These are from the crew," she said, placing the hot chocolates carefully on the tray table in front of Amara. Steam curled up from the lids, each cup sprinkled with tiny marshmallows. "We apologize for earlier, and we thank you for your family's service." Talia nodded, her voice caught for a moment in her throat. "Thank you." Patricia hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "If it's all right, I'd like a word with you in the galley." Talia glanced at Amara. "Sweetheart, I'll be right there." Amara gave her a thumbs up, already sipping the hot chocolate like it was liquid gold. Talia rose from her seat and followed Patricia to the front, passing rows of quiet passengers and the curious eyes that tracked every step. Inside the galley, the world felt smaller again. The buzz of the cabin behind them dimmed. Patricia leaned against the counter, her posture no longer stiff. Her shoulders had dropped slightly. Her face looked different now. Not apologetic, more reverent. "I've been flying for over 30 years, she began. "Seen all kinds of people, all kinds of stories. But I never thought I'd meet someone from Colonel Owens's family." Talia tilted her head. "You knew him?" Patricia nodded. "My father did. Lieutenant Jack Morgan, bomber pilot, World War II. His crew was hit bad over Europe. They weren't going to make it. But a pair of red-tailed Mustangs showed up, wouldn't let the Germans finish the job." She reached into her pocket and unfolded a faded photo. 2 young men in uniform, one black, one white, shoulder to shoulder. Their eyes looked tired but proud. "That's your grandfather," Patricia whispered. "And this is my dad." Talia stared at the photo, her breath hitched. The paper trembled in her hand. Patricia placed a hand over hers. "I think my father would want you to have it." Talia held the photograph with both hands. The edges were worn smooth, like time had been stroking it for decades. Her grandfather stood tall in the image, dressed in full flight gear, eyes locked on the camera with a kind of steel and stillness that couldn't be taught. Next to him, Patricia's father, equally young and weathered, stood with an arm resting across her grandfather's shoulder. There was no smile, no posing, just presence. Talia blinked back, the heat rising behind her eyes. "Never told us," she whispered. Patricia gave a soft nod. "My dad didn't talk about it much either. But that day, he always said those red tails came out of nowhere, flew like ghosts. He said one of them peeled off from the formation, wouldn't leave their side, even when enemy fighters started closing in." Talia touched the face in the photo gently. "Grandpa said he just did what he was trained to do. Maybe. But my father said he saved 6 lives that day, including his." Patricia stepped back, giving Talia space. "You come from something strong," she said quietly. Talia nodded. "I'm starting to understand that now." Back in row 10, Amara was carefully peeling the lid off her hot chocolate while Keanu sat quietly behind her, hands resting on his knees. The cabin had regained its hum, but there was something different now. A reverence had settled into the aisle. Something unspoken but deeply felt. A flight attendant came down the aisle with a tray of snacks and paused by Talia's row. "Anything else for your daughter, sir?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "He's not my daughter." The attendant smiled awkwardly. "Sorry, I just meant..." Keanu gave a small nod toward Talia, who was returning to her seat. "Because he has a mother." "A good one." The attendant nodded quickly and moved on. Talia sat down slowly, her fingers still trembling as she tucked the photo into her purse. "She gave this to me," she said to Keanu, her voice low. "I should have," he replied. Amara looked up at them both. "Are we still flying soon?" Keanu smiled. "Yes, and you've got the best seat on the whole plane." She grinned, swinging her feet. "Good. Ginger hates waiting." Talia let out a quiet laugh, resting a hand over Amara's leg. Keanu's eyes lingered on the two of them for a moment, then drifted forward, back toward the moment that had brought him here. He didn't often talk about Chad. That trip had stayed buried under layers of other work, other travels, other missions. But now the memory came clearly. The heat, the dust, the absolute silence after the gunfire stopped. It had been 12 years ago. Keanu had flown to Chad as part of a private relief mission. No media, no entourage, just a quiet partnership with an aid organization trying to rebuild a clinic in a rural region. Supplies were scarce and tensions in the surrounding areas were rising. Most celebrities avoided these places. He'd come because he believed in showing up, not just signing checks. They were 2 days into the mission when everything shifted. His convoy had been rerouted through an unfamiliar road due to a blocked bridge. They hadn't gone more than 6 miles before the lead truck stopped suddenly. There was shouting. Then the crack of gunfire tore through the silence like lightning. They were caught between 2 warring militias. No warning, no exit. Keanu had been pushed to the ground by one of the medics, told to stay down and keep his head covered. He remembered the sting of the dirt in his mouth, the panic of wondering if anyone knew where they were. The radios were jammed. GPS was barely functional. No way to call for backup through normal channels. But one of the local contacts, an older translator with US connections, had kept a number. A single number. He said it belonged to a retired colonel who still had friends in the right places. He made the call using an emergency sat phone, fingers shaking. Keanu hadn't heard the conversation, only that it was short, direct. The man on the other end didn't ask for credentials, he asked for coordinates. And 3 hours later, in the middle of the night, a blacked-out aircraft appeared on the edge of the clearing. It was fast, quiet, and flown by people who didn't wear insignias but carried themselves like ghosts of another war. They dropped ropes, pulled survivors from the brush. No names, no questions. They were flown to a secure medical facility near the coast. By morning, the entire thing had been buried under diplomatic silence. Keanu tried to find out who had made it happen. The aid organization wouldn't tell him. The translator disappeared back into the village. But a year later, an envelope arrived at his home. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in an old military font. It said, "Robert Owens sends his regards. No need to repay, just stand for someone when it matters." Keanu had kept that paper folded in the same leather case he'd shown today. For 12 years, he never talked about it. Until now. He looked at Talia and Amara again. "You're not moving," he said softly. And as if on cue, the family standing by the galley took a slow step backward. The man in the blazer gave Dale a tight nod and turned around. His wife followed without a word, her face unreadable, her heels clicking dully against the floor. Their son looked up once at Amara, then looked away quickly. No confrontation, no argument, just quiet retreat. Dale stood still, hands clasped behind his back, trying to recover his professionalism. Keanu turned slightly in his seat to face him. If they still want to fly today, they can take the next flight. Dale's jaw tensed, but he nodded once. "Yes, sir. That won't be a problem." The passengers, scattered throughout the cabin, gave small nods. Others murmured softly. It wasn't a cheer or an applause. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Support moved like a quiet wave through the cabin. A man in row 9 leaned forward and whispered to Talia, "Your grandfather's name should be on a school or an airport." Talia smiled faintly. He'd say his name didn't need to be anywhere, as long as his people were free. Amara looked up again, chewing thoughtfully on the edge of her cup. "Mommy, what's a colonel?" Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. "A leader, someone who watches out for others, even when no one's watching them." Amara nodded slowly. "Like you did?" Keanu looked at her with something almost shy in his expression. "Maybe, but I learned it from people like your grandfather." Patricia returned once more, now calmer, more respectful in her presence. "I've informed the captain. We're cleared for final prep. I've also arranged for early exit if your party would prefer assistance upon arrival." Talia nodded. "Thank you." Patricia looked down at Amara. "And you let me know if Ginger gets cold. I've got a blanket just her size." Amara giggled. "Very nice. She likes window seats." "Smart giraffe," Patricia said. As Patricia walked back up the aisle, the calm began to settle once more. The hum of conversation returned. The flight crew resumed their final checks. Keanu leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. The memory of that mission still echoed inside him. The gunfire, the fear, the sound of a rope slapping against metal, and the face he never saw. Colonel Owens, the man who pulled strings and broke silence to save a stranger. He hadn't come on this flight to remember any of it. But here he was, beside the granddaughter of the man who had once moved heaven and earth to bring him home. Now it was his turn. He didn't save her with weapons or rescue plans. He saved her with presence, with stillness, with the refusal to step aside. And in doing so, he realized sometimes honoring the past wasn't about ceremony. It was about standing up, seat by seat, so the next child in a yellow dress didn't have to stand alone. The plane continued its quiet drift through the sky, the rhythm of flight slowly returning. The earlier tension hadn't vanished, but it had softened into something calmer. The weight of what had happened still hovered in the aisle, but now it felt like something honorable instead of something heavy. From the front galley, a younger crew member walked down the aisle carrying a small tray. Her expression was different from Melissa's earlier formality. Her steps were careful, her eyes softer. She stopped at row 10 and gently placed 2 steaming cups on the tray table in front of Talia and Amara. "These are from the crew," she said, almost in a whisper. "Our sincerest apologies." Talia nodded quietly. "Thank you." Amara's eyes lit up as she peered into the cups. Each one was topped with tiny marshmallows, already beginning to melt into the rich cocoa below. "Ginger's never had hot chocolate before," she said. The crew member smiled. "Then this will be her first flight tradition." Amara lifted the cup carefully, holding it with both hands like it was something sacred. She took a sip, closed her eyes, and let out a long sigh of delight. Talia finally leaned back in her seat, her hands folding across her lap. For the first time since they arrived at the airport, she allowed her shoulders to drop. Not all the way, but enough. Across the aisle, a woman in a dark green blouse and silver-framed glasses leaned forward slightly. "I hope you don't mind me saying something," she began. Her voice was warm, steady, educated. Talia turned toward her. "Of course." The woman smiled and extended her hand across the aisle. "My name is Dr. Clarice Monroe. I'm a historian. I teach at Georgetown. Years ago, I had the honor of interviewing your grandfather for a documentary I was producing on black military aviators." Talia's eyebrows lifted. "You interviewed him?" Clarice nodded, her eyes glinting. He didn't like talking about himself. But when I brought up the Tuskegee Airmen, something shifted in him. He told me stories I'll never forget. Things that never made it into the public record. The quiet heroics. The invisible battles. He changed more than just missions. He changed how we understand military history. Talia swallowed hard. He never told us much, just little pieces, here and there. Clarice gave a gentle nod. "That sounds like him." Amara leaned over her mother's lap and peeked at the woman. "Did he ever fly a red plane?" Clarice laughed softly. "Yes, a red-tailed P-51 Mustang, fast, beautiful, and dangerous." Amara's eyes widened. "Did it have a name?" Clarice paused. "Yes, it did. He called it Midnight Echo." Talia blinked. "I never knew that." Clarice smiled again. "There's a lot about him that people don't know, but the ones who needed him most never forgot him." Keanu, still listening from row 11, leaned slightly forward. "That name sounds exactly like the man I remember." Amara sat up straighter, the hot chocolate momentarily forgotten in her lap. "Can you tell me a story about him?" Clarice tilted her head thoughtfully. "I'd be honored to." Talia gave a nod of encouragement. "She loves stories, and we're going to visit him tomorrow." Clarice's face softened. "Then let me tell you one he shared with me. It was during the final months of World War II. She took a breath, eyes briefly distant as she recalled the details. "There was a bomber crew, a mixed unit, mostly young white boys who'd barely finished training. Their aircraft had lost power after a hit over enemy territory. Fuel leaking, engines failing. They were going down." Amara leaned closer, clutching Ginger against her chest. Clarice continued. "They called for cover. But no one responded. Communications were scattered. Everyone was stretched thin. They were flying blind, losing altitude fast." She looked directly at Amara. But one voice came through. Calm, low, steady. "It was your great-grandfather. He and his wingmen had been flying a different route. They weren't even supposed to be near that part of the sky." Talia's brows furrowed. "Then why was he there?" Clarice smiled. "Because he said something felt wrong, so he changed course." Keanu nodded slowly. "That sounds like him." Clarice went on. "Held the bomber, smoking, half the crew injured, German fighters already circling like sharks. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask permission. He dove straight in. Covered that plane with his wing, drew fire, and held position until they were clear." Amara gasped. "Was he scared?" Clarence looked at her. "He said he wasn't fearless, he was focused. There's a difference." Talia whispered, "He never told us this." Clarice shrugged gently. Some men don't need to tell stories when they've lived them. Amara's voice was small but firm. That's why I'm wearing yellow. I want him to see me and remember something happy. Clarice blinked. That's beautiful. Keanu reached forward and gently tapped the back of Talia's seat. Your daughter is remarkable. Talia turned slightly, offering a quiet smile. She gets it from him and my mother. They both had this quiet fire. Amara interrupted. And from Mommy, too. That earned a warm laugh from both women. Clarice looked across the aisle at Keanu. You said he saved you. That wasn't just a metaphor, was it? Keanu shook his head. It wasn't. Clarence leaned back in her seat, a long breath leaving her chest. Then maybe this flight was more than chance. Talia glanced out the window. Clouds stretched below them like soft mountains, untouched and endless. Maybe it was. Amara pressed her face to the glass again. I don't see any dragons yet, she said, but I think Grandpa's flying near us. Talia kissed her forehead. Oh, probably is. The plane settled into a smooth rhythm again. Passengers began to return to their books, movies, and quiet conversations, but the area around row 10 remained gently electric. It was no longer tension. It was reverence. A hush that came not from fear, but from respect. He arrived briefly, this time without formality. He approached Keanu and Talia with his hands relaxed at his sides. Mr. Reeves, Miss Owens, I just wanted to say again, on behalf of the flight crew, we're grateful for your patience. Talia nodded politely. Thank you for making it right. Dale turned to Amara and offered a small smile. And thank you for being brave. Amara grinned. Ginger says you're welcome. Dale chuckled and stepped away, giving them space. Talia took another sip of her drink. It had cooled slightly, but still warmed her chest. She looked over at Clarice, who was jotting notes into a small, weathered notebook. What are you writing? Clarice looked up. Thoughts. Memories. Sometimes when I hear something powerful, I write down the pieces before they float away. Do you still make documentary? Clarice nodded. Not for networks anymore. These days I work more with museums, oral histories, projects that keep voices from being lost. Talia hesitated. If you ever do one about him again, Clarice's smile was immediate. You'd be the first call I'd make. Amara perked up again. Will there be pictures of Grandpa when he was young? Oh, yes, Clarice said. Some in black and white, some from military files. I even have one of him standing on the wing of Midnight Echo. Amara clutched her stuffed giraffe tighter. He's a real hero. Clarice met her eyes. Yes, sweetheart, he truly is. From row 11, Keanu watched the exchange quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to lead the conversation, but there was something in his gaze. A quiet understanding that not all stories are his to tell, and sometimes the best thing he could do was protect the space where others' truths could rise. Talia turned to him. I'm still not sure why you stood up, but I'm glad you did. Keanu answered without hesitation. Because someone once stood for me when no one else would. I couldn't forget that. And I couldn't ignore what was happening. He paused, then looked at Amara. She reminded me what that moment felt like, and what silence costs. Amara didn't fully understand his words, but she smiled anyway. Talia leaned her head back against the seat. For a long time, I thought legacy was something left behind, but maybe it's something we carry with us. Clarice nodded slowly. It's both. It lives in memory and in motion. As the clouds outside thickened and the sun began its slow dip toward the horizon, the 3 rows remained quiet. But something had changed. Legacy wasn't just a story they were remembering. It was one they were still writing. The seatbelt sign had been turned off for nearly half an hour when Talia quietly unbuckled hers and stood. Amara had just dozed off, her cheek resting against the stuffed giraffe's fuzzy head, hot chocolate still half so on the tray table in front of her. Keanu noticed Talia glance down the aisle toward the front galley. She turned toward him. "I'm going to stretch for a minute." Keanu nodded once. "Need company?" Talia considered, then gave the slightest nod. They moved carefully down the aisle, stepping over briefcases and tucked feet. The galley was empty when they arrived. A faint hum came from the beverage cart behind the curtain. Talia leaned against the wall, crossing her arms loosely over her chest. She didn't speak for a moment. Neither did Keanu. The quiet was comfortable, like both of them needed it to settle everything that had just happened. Finally, Talia looked up. "I still don't understand why you stood up for us." Keanu shifted his weight slightly, folding his hands together in front of him. "Because I've been silent before," he said. His voice wasn't defensive. It was reflective, the kind of truth spoken by someone who had turned it over in his mind more than once. "There've been moments," he continued, "when I knew something wasn't right. And I didn't do enough. Not because I didn't care, but because I thought being quiet and kind was the same thing as doing the right thing." Talia tilted her head. "And it's not?" He looked at her now. Really looked. "No, it's not. Silence is comfortable, but it's not neutral. Not when someone else is paying the price." Talia let that sit for a moment. "My daughter," she began, then stopped. She let out a slow breath. "She's 7, and she's already asking questions about why people look at us the way they do, why we get placed by the kitchen in restaurants, why people speak slowly to me when I'm wearing a blazer but ignore me when I'm in jeans." Keanu nodded. "Because she's noticing. Kids do. They always do." Talia gave a quiet laugh, but there was no joy in it. "I thought I had to protect her from all of it. But maybe I just need to teach her how to hold her ground." "She's already learning that," Keanu said. "She saw you stay seated, calm, strong. You didn't let them move you. And she saw you stand," Talia said. Keanu looked down for a second, then up again. "Your daughter reminded me that kindness isn't always enough. Sometimes you have to rise, you have to speak, even when it's uncomfortable." Talia's eyes softened. "I think she reminded all of us." They stood in silence again, letting the weight of the moment pass between them like something sacred. Then Keanu leaned slightly against the wall and spoke again. More gently this time. "I never got to meet your grandfather face to face, not officially, but I've carried the impact of what he did every day since." Talia's voice was soft. He would have liked hearing that. Keanu hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting with him since he heard the name. "Would it be all right if I met him? I don't want to intrude, I think I need to thank him in person." Talia blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. He's not the same man he was. Time's slowed him down. The war's still in his bones, I think. But he still remembers everything that matters. Keanu nodded once. "Then he'll remember me. Or at least the reason he stepped in." Talia gave a small smile. "He'll be honored. He really will." Just then, a soft voice echoed from down the aisle. "Mommy?" They both turned. Amara was standing near row 10, her giraffe tucked under one arm, her eyes still sleepy but curious. "Are you coming back?" Talia reached out a hand toward her. "Yes, baby. Just getting a stretch." Amara walked forward slowly, then looked up at Keanu. "Are you coming with us?" Talia raised her eyebrows slightly. Amara had overheard more than they realized. Keanu smiled, modest and warm. "If that's okay with you." Amara nodded without hesitation. "You should. Grandpa likes brave people." Keanu crouched slightly so he was eye level with her. "Then I'd like to meet him." Talia looked between the two of them and shook her head, a smile slowly forming on her face. "Well, that settles it." They returned to their seats together. Amara curled back into her spot with Ginger, content now that her mother and Keanu were beside her again. Talia reached into her carry-on and pulled out a small notebook and pen. She jotted down her address, then tore the page and passed it to Keanu. "That's where we'll be tomorrow, in D.C. It's not far from the airport." Keanu folded the paper carefully and slid it into his wallet. "I'll be there." Clarice leaned across the aisle again, having overheard just enough to catch the sentiment. "I might have to come by too. I have some old recordings your grandfather might enjoy hearing again." Talia nodded. "You're welcome, anytime." Clarice looked at Amara and smiled. "Your family is going to help remind the world of something important." Amara blinked. "What?" Clarice said that some legacies don't live in buildings or books. They live in people, in actions, and in moments just like this. The flight continued. The plane coasted above a blanket of clouds that stretched out endlessly beneath them, soft and white and silent. From their seats, Row 10 had become its own kind of island, a place suspended in time. Not isolated, but insulated. Protected by something bigger than metal and sky. Amara leaned over to whisper to her mother. "When we get there, do you think Grandpa will like Keanu?" Talia looked over at Keanu, who was now sipping water and flipping through a small notebook of his own. She smiled to herself. "I think Grandpa already would." Amara sat up straighter. "Can I tell him about what happened?" Talia nodded. "Absolutely. He'll want to hear every word." Amara turned to Keanu. "Will you tell him your part too?" Keanu looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I will, but I think your part's more important." Amara giggled. "I'll tell him you stood up and that I got hot chocolate with marshmallows. That might be the best part," Keanu said with a grin. The rest of the flight passed quietly. Patricia returned with a coloring book for Amara and another blanket tucked around her legs. Clarice dozed off across the aisle, her notebook now closed and resting on her lap. Dale checked in one final time, no longer with hesitation, but with sincere respect. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., the captain's voice echoed through the cabin, announcing the weather and estimated arrival time. Passengers stirred, bags were zipped, seat backs adjusted. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and felt for the folded slip of paper Talia had given him. He held it for a moment, then tucked it into the front of his notebook with a quiet nod. When the wheels touched down, Amara clapped once, then caught herself and laughed. "Oops, I forgot we're not supposed to cheer." Talia leaned over. "It's okay, today I think we're allowed." Keanu looked out the window. The city rolled into view. The monuments, the roads, the old bones of American memory standing tall against the golden light of early evening. As they taxied to the gate, Patricia appeared once more. "Mrs. Owens, Mr. Reeves, the captain would like to offer you and your daughter the opportunity to deplane first. It's not standard protocol, but some things matter more." Talia looked at Keanu. He simply nodded. "Thank you," Talia said. When the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt signs turned off, they stood. Talia lifted their bag. Keanu reached to help, and she let him. Tamara stood between them, giraffe in one hand, book in the other. As they walked up the aisle together, passengers stepped aside, not out of obligation, but with understanding. 2 chairs had held space for something bigger that day, and now a legacy was moving forward. The car ride from the airport was quiet. The afternoon sun stretched long golden lines across the pavement as they passed through the tree-lined neighborhoods of northeast Washington, D.C. The streets were familiar to Talia, layered with memories of holidays, family gatherings, and quiet Sunday dinners. But today felt different. Something unspoken rode with them in the back seat, a sense that the moment they were heading toward would not just be remembered, it would become part of the story that defined them all. Keanu sat beside her, hands resting in his lap, his expression thoughtful. Amara leaned against her mother, Ginger tucked under one arm, staring out the window with sleepy eyes and questions she hadn't yet put into words. The driver turned onto a quiet block of red brick row houses. Each one bore the marks of age and care. Trim painted by hand, steps scrubbed clean, flags fluttering gently from porches. Talia pointed to the house near the end of the street. There it is. The home stood proud but modest, its steps worn smooth from decades of use. The brass numbers beside the door gleamed in the afternoon light. The shutters were freshly painted. A wreath made of red and gold leaves hung on the front door. It was the kind of home built by hands that valued steadiness over show. As the car rolled to a stop, the front door opened. A tall woman stood there, arms folded, eyes sharp and knowing. Her silver-streaked locks were pulled into a low bun, and her stance radiated both strength and welcome. Talia stepped out of the car, smiling. Olivia. Her cousin stepped down the front steps, embracing her. "You brought guests," Olivia said with a glance toward the car. Amara jumped out next, holding her giraffe, and nodded seriously. "This is Keanu. He saved our seats on the plane." Olivia raised an eyebrow at Keanu. "The Keanu?" He gave a modest smile. "Guilty." "Well then," Olivia said, stepping aside. "You're family now. Come on in." Inside, the house was cool and filled with the scent of polished wood and something older. Leather, pipe smoke, old books. Photographs lined the walls, black and white portraits in silver frames, men in uniforms, women in hats and gloves, children frozen in moments of joy. They moved slowly through the narrow hallway until Olivia pushed open the door to the back sitting room. The light was dim but warm, filtered through gauzy curtains that danced slightly in the window breeze. In a large wingback chair sat Colonel Robert Owens, 92 years old. A folded blanket rested across his knees. A cane leaned beside the chair. His hands were clasped together. His posture was curved with age, but his eyes were razor sharp. When Keanu stepped into view, the old man smiled. "Well," he said, his voice gravel and warmth. "Didn't expect to see you again, son." Keanu froze. "You remember?" Colonel Owens chuckled softly. "Hard to forget the man whose life we lifted from that canyon." Talia stepped forward, disbelief mixing with emotion in her face. "You never told us he was the one." Colonel Owens looked at his granddaughter with a familiar twinkle in his eyes. "I never saw the point in telling stories just to be remembered. If a man needed help and I could give it, I did. That was enough." Keanu took a few more steps into the room, his voice softer now. "I've thought about that night for years. I didn't know who to thank. I wrote letters, tried to trace the call, but the paper trail ended before it began." Colonel Owens gestured toward the second chair in the room. "Sit, son. No one has to chase thanks in this house." Keanu sat slowly, still processing the fact that the man who saved his life not only remembered him, but greeted him like an old friend. Talia sat across from them, her eyes misted. "You changed our lives again today," she said. "Amara saw something she won't forget." Colonel Owens turned toward the girl, who was standing quietly beside Olivia, unsure whether she could move forward. "Come here, sweetheart." Amara walked forward slowly, then climbed gently onto his lap, careful not to bump his cane. She looked up at him, her expression full of awe. "You're my hero," she said. The colonel smiled, placing a weathered hand on her back. "Then I'd better keep living like one." Amara held out Ginger. "This is Ginger. She flew with us." Colonel Owens took the giraffe in his hand, studying it with mock seriousness. "She looks tough." "She miss," Amara said. "But she still gets scared sometimes." The colonel nodded solemnly. "Even the bravest ones do. The trick is not to stay scared." Talia looked at her grandfather. "He wore yellow today. She wanted you to see her shine." Colonel Owens looked down at Amara's dress and nodded slowly. "Well, she does. Brighter than the sun." Keanu sat silently, taking it all in. The photos on the wall, the sound of the old house settling, the steady breath of a man whose presence still filled the room, even as time weathered his bones. There was a calm here, a peace he hadn't expected. "I never got to say thank you properly," he said again. Colonel Owens looked at him, the same calm in his voice as before. "You just did, by showing up, by standing up. That's what matters." Outside the window, the trees swayed gently in the breeze. The sunlight angled across the hardwood floor, casting soft, golden light over the room. 3 generations sat there, one in a chair, one with her feet barely touching the floor, and one who had spent most of his life being watched and never really seen. In that moment, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The war stories could wait, the medals on the wall could wait. For now, they just sat together in the quiet. The colonel closed his eyes for a moment, resting his chin on Amara's head. "You remind me," he whispered, "of everything I fought for." The sun had shifted by the time Keanu followed Colonel Owens into the study. The walls were lined with shelves, some sagging slightly under the weight of old books, leather-bound volumes, and carefully labeled photo albums. On the far wall hung a flag in a wooden frame, its colors slightly faded, its edges perfectly preserved behind glass. Next to it was a flight helmet, a leather bomber jacket, and a series of framed commendations, ribbons, and letters from presidents, generals, and schoolchildren alike. The colonel moved slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the hardwood floor. Keanu offered to help, but Robert waved him off. "I can still walk my way into this room. Might be the last place I still feel 20 years old." Keanu smiled quietly and waited as the old man settled into a deep armchair facing the window. Robert gestured toward the other seat across from him. "Go ahead." Keanu sat down, resting his elbows gently on his knees, his hands clasped together. The room was quiet, not silent, but filled with the kind of stillness that came from a life full of reflection. "I watched you today," Robert said. "You stood up when it counted. Not many people do." Keanu looked down for a moment. "It didn't feel like enough." Robert tilted his head. "It was something. But don't confuse kindness for justice." Keanu's brow furrowed slightly, thoughtful. Robert continued, voice even and sure. "I've seen a lot of good people walk away thinking they've done enough. They say the right things, they write checks, they shake hands, but they never shake the tree." Keanu nodded slowly. "I've been guilty of that." "You're not alone," Robert said. "The world taught you that quiet is polite, that measured words mean you're wise. But let me tell you something, son. The small injustices, the ones that happen in airports, at counters, in quiet little rooms, they pile up, and they grow roots when the people who can speak choose not to." Keanu didn't speak. He couldn't. He felt the words land like stones, not in punishment, but in truth. Robert looked toward the window, eyes narrowing. "I had a squadron once. Young men who weren't supposed to fly. We were told we couldn't. We were told we shouldn't. We were told we'd fail." He reached to the table beside him and picked up a wooden frame. Inside it was a black and white photograph of a row of pilots standing side by side in front of a plane. The men were young. Some looked barely old enough to vote. Their uniforms were crisp. Their expressions weren't proud. They were determined. Robert held the frame out to Keanu. "This was my crew. Half of them didn't make it home. The rest of us, we carried their names." Keanu took the frame in both hands. The weight of it surprised him, not in pounds, but in meaning. Robert's voice softened. "If you want to repay me, don't name a building. Don't hang a plaque. Make sure this photo means something to the next generation." Keanu stared at the photo. He studied the faces. Each one held a different story, some with smiles half-formed, others staring into the lens like they knew what was coming. These weren't just men. They were legacies. Each of them had stood for something that the world wasn't ready to honor at the time. He looked back at Robert. "I will," Keanu said quietly. "I'll make sure they're remembered." Robert nodded. "Then we're even." But Keanu didn't move. His eyes lingered on the frame again, his thumbs brushing the edge of the wood. "When I was a kid," Keanu said slowly, "I used to think heroes were loud. They had big voices, made big moves, the kind who ran toward fire, broke through doors. But lately, I think the real ones just show up. Not for the credit, not for the spotlight. They show up when someone needs to be seen." Robert smiled faintly. "That's true, but showing up isn't a finish line. It's a beginning. He leaned forward slightly, voice still steady but weighted with years. I've watched generations come and go. I've watched good men let silence guide them. I've watched smart women hold their tongues in rooms they should have led. And I've watched children grow up thinking they had to earn the space they already deserved. He pointed to the photo still in Keanu's hands. Those boys? They didn't just fly planes. They flew through barriers. They carried the fight inside them. They flew like their dignity depended on it. Because it did. Keanu's grip on the frame tightened just slightly. I didn't grow up with much, he said. But I was lucky. People showed me kindness. That's what I tried to give back. Robert gave a slow nod. And that's good. It matters. But kindness isn't a shield for those who need protection. It's a doorway. It gets you in the room. Justice is what keeps the door open for the next person. Keanu let those words settle in the quiet space between them. Then Robert spoke again, softer now. You've got reach, son. More than I ever did. People listen when you talk. So talk. Keanu looked him in the eye. I will. Robert's gaze held his. Then make sure my men's names don't vanish. Make sure no little girl in a yellow dress ever has to ask her mother why someone made her move again. Keanu's face hardened, not with anger, but with conviction. A new kind of fire lit behind his eyes. I promise. Robert leaned back, the weight of the moment easing from his chest. You know, he said, people think legacy is about buildings, medals, statues, but it's not. It's in moments like this. 2 chairs, 1 photo, 1 promise. Keanu stood, still holding the frame. I'll carry it, and I'll make it count. Robert gave him a nod of approval. That's all I ever asked. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set. Long rays of light stretched across the floor, touching the boots by the bookshelf, the worn leather jacket on the wall, and the photo held between 2 hands. Hands of a man who had once been rescued and now carried the story forward. The morning after his visit with Colonel Owens, Keanu flew out of Washington, D.C., quietly and without attention. No handlers, no press, no announcement. Just a direct flight home, a cup of coffee he didn't finish, and a notebook full of thoughts he couldn't shake. By noon, he was in Los Angeles, back in the glass and steel headquarters of North Stream Airlines. He didn't make an appointment. He didn't check in with reception. He simply walked through the lobby in a plain black jacket and soft-soled shoes, passing by the polished logo on the wall, nodding once to the assistant, who called out his name in surprise. He stepped into the executive floor with purpose. The hallway buzzed with the usual energy, briefcase clatters, low murmurs of business calls, the click of polished heels on tile. When he reached the boardroom, the double doors were closed. A meeting was already underway. Keanu opened the doors anyway. The room turned at once. 12 people sat around a long table. Executives in tailored suits, vice presidents with folders open, consultants with tablets mid-swipe. One of them leaned forward. Keanu, we weren't expecting you this morning. I know, Keanu said, but we're not waiting anymore. He walked to the front of the room, laid his notebook on the glass table and opened it. I'm here to talk about something we should have addressed a long time ago. He stood straight, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. I'm launching something today. It's called the Owens Initiative. A few executives glanced at each other. The head of strategy narrowed his eyes. And what exactly is that? Keanu nodded once, prepared. It's a 3-part transformation. First, mandatory anti-bias training and historical education for every member of our flight staff. Not just once, ongoing. Focused on how subtle bias affects passengers every day, especially those who look like the Owens family. One executive raised a brow. This is in response to the DC flight, isn't it? Keanu didn't flinch. The flight was the final spark, but the fire's been burning a long time. We've ignored too many small moments that could have built trust. Instead, they built silence. He flipped to another page in the notebook. Second, we create the Colonel Robert Owens Scholarship Fund, fully funded by the company. A yearly program for students from underrepresented communities who want to enter aviation, whether as pilots, engineers, flight crew, or aviation historians. We'll cover tuition, training, and mentorship. A few voices stirred now, not in protest but in curiosity. Keanu looked around the table. This isn't charity, it's legacy. He flipped to the final page. Third, we redesign our lounge at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. The new space will be called the Owens Legacy Lounge, and it will honor not just Colonel Owens, but every black aviator who never got a photo in a museum or their name on a plaque. We'll build it with dignity, not flash. The room went silent for a beat. Then one executive leaned back in her chair and asked, "Why now?" Keanu's answer was quiet. "Because a girl in a yellow dress reminded me that courage starts in the aisle, not the spotlight." No one spoke right away. The words hung there, not as a performance, but as a truth that had waited too long to be said. The head of operations finally leaned forward. "You're serious about this?" Keanu nodded. "I've already allocated the first 2 years of scholarship funding personally, but I expect the board to commit to long-term sustainability." The CFO glanced down at his notebook, tapped a pen twice against the table. "And the lounge design, have you priced it, consulted with architects?" "I've reached out to 2 design firms already," Keanu said. "Both minority-owned, both with experience creating memorial spaces and public service centers. The proposals will be on your desks by next week." A man near the end of the table cleared his throat. This could stir media attention, good and bad. Keanu looked him in the eye. "Good. Let it stir. That little girl shouldn't have to grow up wondering whether she'll be seen or shuffled. If it takes headlines to make that clear, so be it." The woman from marketing leaned forward slowly. "We've never done anything like this, not at this scale." "Then let's be first," Keanu said. "Not for the optics. For the people who've flown with us for years and never been seen. For the ones who work our gates and our cabins and carry stories no one ever asked to hear." He paused, letting that land. "I stood up once. It helped. But that can't be the end. Legacy is built in systems, not just moments. This company should be known for more than smooth takeoffs. We should be known for who we fly with and how we treat them." There were no objections now. No more cautious glances or hedged language. The room slowly shifted. Heads nodded, pens scribbled. Someone leaned back and exhaled like a weight had finally moved. Keanu reached into his bag and pulled out the framed photo Colonel Owens had given him. He placed it gently on the center of the boardroom table. These men flew missions that history tried to forget. We're not forgetting. Everyone stared at the image. Black and white uniforms, straight backs, quiet fire in every face. "Make this mean something," Keanu said. "That's what he asked me to do." The chair of the board finally spoke. Her voice was clear, grounded. "I think we owe that to them, and to her." She glanced at the photo, then back to Keanu. "The board will vote today, but you have my support." Keanu nodded, but not with relief, with resolve. He didn't want applause. He didn't want a statement. He wanted movement. As he turned to leave, one junior executive called out softly. "What was her name?" Keanu stopped, hand on the door. "Emira." The room stayed still. "She reminded me that sometimes the strongest thing in the world is a child who asks, 'Why are we moving, Mommy?' And the answer isn't good enough." Then he opened the door and walked out. Behind him, the future had already begun shifting. The sky over Washington National Airport was a soft gray, the kind that muted shadows and turned everything beneath it calm and reflective. Inside Terminal B, however, something rare was unfolding. At Gate 32, a space that once held rows of anonymous chairs and hurried passengers now stood transformed. The lights were slightly dimmed, not out of ceremony but respect. Along the windows, velvet ropes created a quiet boundary while a crowd began to gather. Not a crowd of press, not cameras and flashes, but people. Staff in Navy uniforms, pilots in crisp caps, maintenance workers in safety vests, and crew members still wearing name tags. They lined up in neat rows, each standing tall. Many had never met Colonel Owens, and many had never met Colonel Owens, but they knew the name. And today, they came to stand for what it meant. Keanu stood off to one side, dressed in a simple gray suit with no tie. He wasn't trying to command attention. He was there to witness, to honor, and to keep a promise. Down the long corridor, a wheelchair approached, rolling steadily past passengers who paused and stepped aside, sensing something sacred. Colonel Owens sat upright, his Navy blazer pressed and proud, his Air Force pin polished to a quiet gleam. Oxygen tubing ran gently beneath his nose. His hands rested folded over a wooden cane. Talia walked beside him, one hand lightly on the chair's handle. Amara skipped slightly ahead, her yellow dress bouncing just enough to catch the overhead light. As they approached the entrance to the new lounge, the gathered staff shifted to attention. Several saluted, not out of requirement but reverence. The colonel looked around slowly. His eyes scanned the signage, the uniforms, the folded hands. When he spotted Keanu, he gave the smallest nod. Keanu returned it, with steady eyes. A dark blue cloth hung over the polished plaque just beside the lounge doors. A white ribbon, tied in a gentle bow, stretched across the entryway. A pair of gold-handled scissors rested on a satin cushion. Keanu stepped forward and adjusted the microphone. He didn't ask for silence. The room offered it naturally. "Good morning," he said. "Today, we open a space that's more than just a lounge. It's a door to memory, a place built not for the elite, but for the remembered." He looked at Colonel Owens, who stared back with quiet intensity. This man didn't fly to be thanked. He flew so others could return. He flew when the world said he couldn't. And still, he rose. Keanu turned slightly and motioned toward the covered plaque. This space is dedicated not just to him, but to every pilot who carried more than just passengers. They carried dignity, history, and the weight of being unseen. Talia reached down and gently helped Colonel Owens sit a little straighter. Then Keanu turned to Amara. "Miss Amara Owens, would you do the honors?" Amara stepped forward, her eyes wide but steady. The golden scissors were placed gently in her hands. She turned to the crowd, took a breath, and cleared her throat. "Helping people," Amara began, her voice just above a whisper, "isn't something you do once. It's something you grow up to keep doing." The silence in the terminal didn't break. It deepened. Her words were not rehearsed, not coached, just felt. She turned to the ribbon and carefully raised the scissors. With one steady snip, the white ribbon parted. A soft wave of applause moved through the crowd, not thunderous, not theatrical, but meaningful, like breath held and finally released. The cloth was drawn back, revealing the bronze plaque beside the lounge door. Its lettering was carved with precision and grace. The Colonel Robert Owens Unity Lounge, in honor of those who flew so others could rise. The doors to the lounge opened slowly, revealing a warm, elegant space inside. Deep mahogany trim, soft armchairs, historical photos on the walls. Images of black aviators throughout history, including the Tuskegee Airmen, wartime missions, and candid shots of crews that had once flown invisible but essential paths through the sky. In the center of one wall hung the framed photo Colonel Owens had once given Keanu. Below it, a single line was engraved in silver. "Legacy is not what you leave, it's what you lift." The colonel was wheeled inside slowly. His eyes scanned the space. He didn't speak, but his hand tightened around the armrest. Talia walked beside him, brushing a tear quickly from her cheek. Keanu followed just behind them. He paused at the entrance, letting them go first. A pilot near the door turned and looked at him. "This feels different than any space I've seen in an airport." Keanu gave a faint smile. "It's not for passing through, It's for remembering. Inside, Amara stood beneath her great-grandfather's photo. She looked up at it for a long moment. Then she turned to the nearest wall, where small nameplates were embedded beside each portrait. She began to read them aloud, one by one. Keanu stood beside Colonel Owens, who had stopped in front of the window overlooking the tarmac. Outside, a North Stream jet began to taxi down the runway, its nose pointed toward the rising light. The old man broke the silence. "You moved fast, son." Keanu smiled slightly. "Didn't want to waste time." Colonel Owens nodded. "You made it count." They stood together in that stillness, one man at the sunset of his life, the other in its middle, but joined by the same truth, that justice, like flight, begins with lift. And sometimes that lift starts in the quiet, when someone simply says, "Not this time." Talia moved to stand behind her grandfather's chair and rested her hand gently on his shoulder. Clarice Monroe had arrived too. She stood by the far wall taking notes again, this time not for a documentary, just for herself, for the record of a moment that would live beyond the page. The staff filed through the lounge quietly, stopping at each name, each photo, each detail. And in the center of it all stood a little girl in yellow, not asking why anymore, but helping everyone else remember why it mattered. It started with a conversation in the lounge. 2 weeks after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Talia returned to the Colonel Robert Owens Unity Lounge with Amara. They weren't flying anywhere that day. They had simply come to sit in the space and be present. Amara wandered along the wall of portraits while Talia sat quietly with a cup of tea, tracing the engraved line beneath her grandfather's photo. A woman in her late 30s approached with a small notepad and a lanyard bearing a local documentary network's logo. Her eyes were wide, cautious but warm. "Ms. Owens?" Talia turned. "Yes?" "I'm sorry to interrupt. My name's Vanessa Brooks. I'm with Heritage Now Films. We've been following the impact of the Unity Lounge, and after reading the story and hearing the dedication, we believe your grandfather's life deserves a full documentary." Talia blinked. She hadn't expected that. "A full one?" "Yes," Vanessa said. "One that starts with his youth, through the war, through every challenge he faced. Not just the battles in the air, but the ones down here. We believe his story can change the way young people understand history." Talia hesitated, absorbing the idea. Before she could respond, another voice joined from behind. "I think that's long overdue." It was Dr. Clarice Monroe. She stepped forward with her own notebook in hand. "If I may," Clarice added, "I'd like to offer my help. I interviewed him once, but I've spent years researching men like him who never got more than a footnote in history books. I want to help get it right." Talia looked between them, caught off guard by how quickly the idea was taking form. "And you'd fund it yourselves?" Vanessa hesitated. "We're a small outfit. We have grant partners, but something like this would need more. We're hoping—" "I'll handle the funding," Keanu's voice cut in gently. He had arrived just moments before, unnoticed, dressed in jeans and a charcoal t-shirt. His presence was quiet but resolute. North Stream's educational division will back it. Production, distribution, curriculum tie-ins, everything. It's time people knew what justice looks like when it's worn in silence and served at altitude. Vanessa exhaled, stunned. Clarice grinned. Talia finally found her words. "He never did it for attention." Clarice nodded. "That's exactly why it matters." Later that afternoon, back at the family home in D.C., Talia guided Amara up the narrow staircase that led to Robert Owens's personal memorabilia room. It was more than just an attic. It was a quiet museum of medals, letters, pilot logs, and framed newspaper clippings, all carefully preserved over the decades. Amara stood in awe. "This is like a treasure room." Robert, seated nearby in his chair, chuckled softly. "I suppose it is, if history's the treasure." Amara moved to a glass case and pointed. "What's that one?" Robert looked. "My first pilot's pin." She stared at it reverently. "Can I touch it?" Robert nodded. "Go ahead." Amara lifted the small brass pin with both hands, cradling it like something sacred. "Did you always know you were going to fly?" Robert looked at her, eyes warm. "No, but I always knew I had to rise." Amara sat on the floor, legs crossed, the pilot's pin nestled gently in her lap. Her gaze didn't waver from the tiny wings stretched across the polished metal. She touched them with the tip of one finger and looked up. "But how did you rise if people kept saying no?" Robert smiled faintly. "They might, but he didn't stop saying no. They just got quieter once I proved I didn't need their permission." Talia stood nearby, her arms folded as she watched her daughter soak in the moment. She felt the gravity of it in her chest. She had known her grandfather was brave, but she hadn't realized how deeply his quiet battles had shaped the ground beneath their family's feet. Clarice, standing in the doorway with her notebook in hand, finally spoke. "I'd like to include this room in the documentary, the items, the letters, the stories they hold. Would you be willing?" Robert nodded slowly. "Only if it helps someone else learn how to stand. We want to use it as part of an education program," Clarice continued. "We'll take clips from the documentary and build materials that schools can use, not just facts, but context, emotion, humanity." Keanu, leaning in the hallway with arms crossed, added, "We'll partner with educators across the country, public schools, libraries, flight academies. This isn't about legacy, it's about visibility." Robert nodded. "Then make sure the stories stay honest. Don't make me a saint. Just a man who flew when flying wasn't expected." Umara looked up again. "You are a hero, though." Robert smiled. "Maybe, but the world doesn't need more statues. It needs more people who carry truth, quietly, every day." He motioned for Amara to come closer. She stood and walked to his side. He took the pin from her hands, studied it for a moment, then pressed it gently into her palm. "You don't have to fly a plane to rise above the clouds," he told her, voice low and firm. "Just rise when others won't." She closed her fingers around the pin. "I will." The next few weeks passed in a steady hum of work and reverence. The documentary pre-production began. Clarice interviewed Robert at length, drawing out memories buried in silence for decades. Young researchers cataloged every item in his room. North Stream's media team recorded new footage of the lounge, the family home, and Amara reading names aloud from the wall of aviators. Every time someone asked Talia how it all started, she answered the same way. A flight, a clipboard, a man who said no more, and a little girl in yellow who asked the right question. By the time the first footage was ready for preview, it had already been requested by 2 major museums and a dozen school districts. One morning, Amara returned from school and found a package on the table addressed to her. Inside was a note, written in her great-grandfather's handwriting. For Amara, who already knows that history isn't just told, it's carried. The pin was inside, this time mounted on velvet, framed in wood, and engraved below. She rose. Talia placed it beside Amara's bed, and above it, a new story began to take flight. The old brownstone in northeast DC looked almost the same as it had weeks ago. The vines still curled gently along the brick. The stoop was swept clean. The small wooden wind chime that hung from the porch beam clinked softly in the afternoon breeze. But something felt different now. Not on the outside, on the inside. Keanu stood at the base of the steps, a brown, paper-wrapped package under one arm. He looked up and smiled when he saw Amara push open the screen door and step onto the porch, barefoot, holding Ginger the giraffe and a half-eaten apple. "Keanu!" she shouted, grinning wide. He lifted the package slightly in greeting. "I come bearing gifts." Talia appeared behind her daughter, a dish towel slung over one shoulder, her curls loosely tied back. "You're right on time," she said. "We were just about to sit out here." They all settled onto the wide porch swing, which creaked comfortably under their weight. The sunlight filtered through the tall trees lining the street, casting soft patterns across the floorboards. Keanu handed the wrapped item to Amara. "For you. You're the first person to get a copy." Amara's eyes widened as she carefully tore the paper away. Inside was a thin hardcover book, its cover illustrated in warm pastels. A small plane soared across a blue sky, and below it, a girl in a yellow dress held out her hand toward the clouds. Mara read the title out loud, "Wings Like Grandpa's." She flipped it open quickly, her fingers brushing across the dedication page. Talia leaned over to look. "Is this?" Keanu nodded. "A children's book, inspired by your family, based on Colonel Owens's early life, written to help young readers understand the quiet courage behind uniforms and old photographs." Talia turned the pages slowly, taking in the illustrations. Young Robert Owens in his flight suit, the airstrip, the training sessions, the discrimination, the moment he first flew solo. Amara pointed to one of the drawings. "That's the plane with the red tail." Keanu smiled. "Midnight Echo." "You remembered," Talia said. "I didn't forget." Amara turned another page, then hugged the book to her chest. "I'm going to read this to my class." Keanu looked at her with warmth. "That's the idea. To pass it on." They sat for a while, the quiet of the neighborhood broken only by the distant sound of a dog barking and a car engine humming by. Talia watched her daughter study the book and lean back into the swing, her eyes thoughtful. "I've been thinking about writing something myself," she said after a pause. Keanu looked over at her. "A book?" She nodded. "A memoir, not just about my grandfather, about my mother, about being a mother, about flying through storms that don't show up on radar." Keanu listened, then said gently, "Your voice matters. Don't let history forget the women behind the men who flew." Talia turned to him, searching his expression. He meant it, not as a compliment, as a truth. She gave a small nod. "I won't." Amara leaned her head against Keanu's arm without warning, the book still cradled in her lap. "Will you be in the next story?" she asked sleepily. Keanu chuckled. "I think this one belongs to you. But you helped us." He gave a small smile. "That's just one page. You're the rest." Talia laughed gently, then quieted. The breeze picked up again, lifting a corner of the porch mat. Keanu reached down and straightened it, absent-mindedly. Talia sipped from a cup of tea she'd brought out earlier. "You know, I used to think legacy was only built by men in uniform, the ones with medals, wings, ribbons." She looked out toward the street, where a young boy pedaled past on a bike, his training wheels clicking rhythmically. But maybe legacy's also built in kitchens, in classrooms, in early morning flights and late night stories. Maybe it's in choosing not to move when someone tells you to. Keanu nodded slowly. "I think that's exactly where it lives." The wind moved again, rustling the leaves on the trees. Somewhere inside the house, a clock chimed the hour. Keanu stood after a moment, stretching lightly. "I should head back," he said, "but I wanted to see you both before the next leg of all this." Talia stood too. "You mean the documentary?" "Steps." "And a few more steps we're taking with North Stream. Pilot training programs, school tours, more scholarship work." He paused. "I think we've only started something, and that means staying in motion." Amara stood as well, still barefoot, still clutching the book. "Where will I see you again?" Keanu knelt slightly, so they were eye level. "Soon. And I want you to keep telling Grandpa's story until everyone in your class can say his name without looking at a paper." She nodded solemnly. "Promise?" He smiled. "And keep reading that book to everyone who'll listen." "I will." Talia followed Keanu down the porch steps as Amara skipped back inside. They stopped at the gate. "You really changed things," she said quietly. Keanu shook his head. "I just stood up when it was overdue. The change is because of you, because of him, because of her." Talia touched the gate latch absently. "Still, thank you." Keanu looked at her one last time. "You're welcome." He started walking. The street stretched ahead, bathed in the kind of afternoon light that made every leaf look like stained glass. At the corner, he paused and turned back for a moment. Talia was still at the gate, one hand raised in goodbye. He lifted his in return, then continued down the block. Back on the porch, the swing creaked again. Amara had returned with a pencil and her new book, scribbling something on the inside cover. Talia stepped back inside and glanced over her shoulder. The wind chime rang softly behind her, and in that still afternoon air, the story continued. Not in a headline, not in a speech, but in a girl, a porch, and the book that would carry them both higher. It was a quiet morning when it happened. Talia had come down the stairs, already dressed, the kettle just starting to boil. The house was still, filled with that early light that made everything look softer, slower. She walked into the sitting room with the intention of checking on him, like she always did. But today there was no movement. Colonel Robert Owens lay in his chair, a folded blanket over his lap, his hands resting gently on the armrests. His head tilted slightly to the side, eyes closed, mouth relaxed. The oxygen tubing still in place. The same old photograph of his squadron sat on the side table. Talia didn't need to speak. She didn't need to check his pulse. She knew. She knelt beside him slowly, her hand covering his, tears welling quietly behind her eyes. Hell went peacefully, the hospice nurse said later. No struggle, no pain, just rest. Word spread faster than Talia expected. Calls poured in. Messages from former students, military historians, flight captains, and even quiet neighbors who remembered seeing the colonel wheeling along the sidewalk in his cap and blazer. A service was arranged within days. It was held at Arlington, as he requested. No parade, no speeches longer than necessary. He didn't want a spectacle. But that didn't stop them from coming. The rows of white chairs, filled with people from all corners of his life. Tuskegee airmen who had once trained beside him. Young ROTC students who had studied his history and now wore his unit patch. Airline staff from Northstream arrived in uniform. Teachers, authors, children who had read Wings like grandpas and brought copies with hand-colored pages. Clarice Monroe sat near the front, her notebook closed in her lap for once. Talia wore a soft gray dress, simple and elegant. Her cousin Olivia sat beside her, quietly supportive. And in the center of it all sat Amara, dressed in yellow. She didn't cry much, not because she wasn't grieving, but because she was holding something. She carried a small velvet box in her lap, and when the service began, she never looked away from the casket draped in the American flag. The folded pilot's wings lay atop it already, beside a carefully chosen photo of Robert Owens at age 23, in flight gear, with that steady gaze that never blinked for the camera. Keanu stood near the podium. He hadn't planned to speak, but Talia had asked him, and he couldn't say no. When it was his turn, he stepped forward slowly, hands at his sides, voice low but unwavering. "Some men fight to be remembered," he said. "They build legacies out of monuments and microphones." He looked down at the flag-covered casket, but not him. His voice caught for a breath, but he kept going. Colonel Owens didn't fight for attention. He fought so others could come home. He didn't just rise in the sky. He lifted all of us with him. He paused again, this time letting the silence speak for a moment. Hell gave us more than a story. He gave us a standard. After the final words were spoken, the service moved to the gravesite. A light breeze rustled the leaves overhead. The sun filtered through the trees in long ribbons, soft and golden. The honor guard stepped forward. 6 men, perfectly aligned, lifted the casket with precision and reverence. The sound of taps began in the distance. It cut through the stillness like a single thread of sorrow, winding its way around every heart gathered there. Talia reached for Amara's hand. The little girl held tightly to the velvet box in the other. When they reached the headstone, the casket was lowered slowly. The honor guard folded the flag with practiced grace, passing it carefully to Talia, who received it with a bowed head. Then the officiant nodded gently toward Amara. She took a slow step forward. The crowd watched as she opened the velvet box and removed the pilot pin, Robert Owen's first. The same one he had given her in the attic weeks ago. The same one he had worn on every mission. She stood in front of the casket, her hands small but steady, and with the quiet of a child who understood more than her age would suggest, she placed the pin atop the wood, just below the folded flag. Then she stepped back, wiping her face with the back of her hand, but not hiding her tears. Above, a low rumble began in the sky. Everyone turned their eyes upward. 4 vintage planes, polished silver against the deep blue sky, soared into view. They flew in formation, engines growling softly, and then, as they passed directly overhead, the lead plane pulled away, a lone trail arcing skyward in the traditional missing man formation. As tribute to a fallen pilot, Amara watched them go, her face upturned, her eyes glistening. "Fly safe, Grandpa," she whispered. Talia wrapped her arms around her daughter from behind, holding her close. Clarice wiped her cheek, her notes forgotten in her bag. Keanu stood off to the side, one hand in his pocket, the other resting gently on his chest. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because everyone there knew what had just passed wasn't just a man. It was a legacy taking flight. Later that afternoon, the brownstone was filled with quiet voices. Food was set out on the dining table. Visitors came in waves, offering stories, condolences, and embraces. Veterans swapped tales. Airline staff shared moments from recent flights. Students asked about the scholarship fund, now officially named in full, the Colonel Robert Owen's Future Flight Foundation. In the study upstairs, Amara returned to the bookshelf where his medals were displayed. She reached up and pulled the children's book from the shelf, Wings Like Grandpa's, and sat on the floor. She opened it to the first page and began reading aloud, her voice gentle and full of memory. Talia stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't interrupt. She knew this wasn't just a story anymore. It was a goodbye, wrapped in words, and a promise that legacy doesn't end with silence. It begins with someone willing to rise. The auditorium lights dimmed slowly, and a hush fell over the crowd. It was a chilly Monday morning in Harlem, but inside the school auditorium, warmth radiated from every corner. Students filled the rows, some in matching uniforms, some in hoodies and sneakers. Teachers lined the back wall, arms crossed, eyes bright with anticipation. Parents whispered softly to one another. Administrators straightened ties and adjusted blazers. The room wasn't packed because of a celebrity. It was filled because of a promise. On stage, the banner above the curtain read, "The Robert Owens Fellowship Launch, Changing the Sky, One Child at a Time." Keanu stood just off stage, holding a single page of notes he hadn't looked at once. He wasn't there to promote a film or give a lecture. He was there because something inside him had shifted the day Amara asked, "Are we in trouble?" And that shift had not stopped. The school principal stepped up to the podium first. She was a tall woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice that carried both strength and grace. "Today," she began, "we don't just celebrate the legacy of a great man. We invest in the next generation of skybreakers, those who will rise not just in the air, but above limitation, bias, and silence." She turned toward the wings. "Please welcome someone who turned a moment into a movement. Mr. Keanu Reeves." The applause was immediate but gentle, as if the audience instinctively knew that today was not about him. Keanu walked on stage wearing a dark sweater, black jeans, and worn boots. Nothing fancy, just honest. He approached the podium, looked out at the rows of young faces, and spoke. "This isn't about me," he said simply. "It's about the children whose names we don't yet know, but whose futures will change the sky." A pause. He continued, "The Robert Owens Fellowship is more than a scholarship. It's a path for every student who's ever looked up at a plane and thought, I could never do that. For every kid who was told their dreams were too expensive, too complicated, or too different. He glanced at the first row, where Amara sat with her classmates, eyes shining. This initiative includes full pilot training for underserved youth, mentorship from retired aviators, and a national storytelling project, one that finds and shares the hidden heroes in our communities. Behind him, the screen lit up with images, photos of unsung pilots, maintenance crews, flight instructors, navigators. Some smiling, some serious, all important. The auditorium remained still. The silence wasn't boredom, it was respect. Keanu closed his note and said quietly, "We want to teach kids how to fly, yes, but more than that, we want to teach them how to rise. And how to help others rise too." Then he stepped aside. The principal returned to the microphone. "And now we have a very special student who's prepared something of her own." Amara stood from her seat, holding a large sheet of paper folded in half. She wore her yellow dress again, now paired with a denim jacket covered in patches. She walked carefully to the stage and climbed the stairs slowly. Amara reached the center of the stage and turned to face the crowd. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice carried. Not loud, but clear. "My great-grandpa always said flying wasn't just about being in the sky. It was about lifting people. So I drew something to remember that." She unfolded her paper, holding it up with both hands. The image was hand-drawn, but vivid. A large plane flew through a sky made of book pages. In the cockpit sat her grandfather, wearing his full uniform, but instead of metal wings, the aircraft's wings were built from open books. Words, pages, poems, and stories fluttering as it flew. Below, people of every shape, color, and size looked up, reaching, some with their own books in hand, others holding hands with children. At the bottom of the page, in her neat handwriting, it read, "Stories lift us." The audience sat frozen for a second, letting it settle. Then the applause came. Not forced, not polite. Real. First, the teachers stood, then the parents, then the students. The entire auditorium rose to their feet in a wave of clapping, some with tears in their eyes. The drawing wasn't just art, it was truth. And in that truth was a kind of clarity they hadn't expected to feel on a Monday morning in a school auditorium. Keanu stepped forward again, crouching beside Amara to take a closer look at the drawing. "This," he said into the mic, "is what legacy looks like." Amara smiled up at him, proud but humble. He turned to the crowd. "We'll be featuring this drawing in every piece of material related to the Robert Owens Fellowship, every training center, every pilot manual, every lounge, because we want future aviators to know that wings come in many forms." He paused, then added, "And this little artist just gave us the clearest version of them all." After the event, students gathered around Amara asking questions, some about her grandfather, others about drawing. A few asked how they could become pilots. One boy asked if they had to be rich. "No," Amara told him. "You just have to be ready to rise when someone tells you to stay down." Keanu stood with the principal in the hallway afterward, watching the kids buzz with energy. "They're going to remember this day," she said. "They're supposed to," Keanu replied. Later that evening, North Stream's media team released the official announcement video across all platforms. It opened with Amara's voice reading the words on her drawing, followed by footage from the ceremony, the flyover, and a brief clip of Colonel Owens saluting from his chair weeks before his passing. Within hours, the video had gone viral. By morning, applications for the first round of fellowships had tripled expectations. Clarice Monroe was already in production on a follow-up piece titled "Legacy in Yellow, The Flight Path of a Family." And in a quiet house in Harlem, Talia watched it all unfold from her kitchen window, holding a mug of tea and smiling. Upstairs, Amara was working on her next drawing. This one showed a classroom with kids sitting at desks, but the desks had wheels. Each child had wings sprouting from their backs. At the chalkboard, A teacher with a flight helmet wrote in big letters, "Courage takes off here." The sky wasn't the limit anymore. It was just the beginning. The park was quiet that morning. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but the kind of stillness that comes after something important has passed. The grass was freshly cut. The wind moved slowly through the old oak trees, carrying with it the scent of spring and the weight of memory. Birds called softly from the branches. A plane, high above, left a silver arc across the sky, barely audible, a whisper of motion. Keanu sat on a bench overlooking the field where Colonel Owens had once trained new recruits. The bench was made of weathered wood. Nothing polished, nothing grand. It didn't need to be. Sometimes, the most sacred places are the ones that don't try to prove anything. He had come alone, not because he wanted solitude, but because this visit wasn't meant to be shared with noise or ceremony. It was about presence, about remembering. In the palm of his hand rested a small carved wing made of cherry wood. Its edges were smooth, its shape simple, but it held meaning. A tribute, a symbol, a promise. He turned it over once, then placed it gently on the bench beside him. The bench had held many things over the years: coffee cups, worn notebooks, tired hands, and quiet thoughts. Now, it held a legacy. A breeze rustled through the grass in front of him, and Keanu leaned back, breathing in the moment. Not far off, laughter echoed down the path. Amara came running through the trees, her yellow dress catching sunlight with every step. Ginger the giraffe swung wildly from one hand, and her curls bounced freely behind her. She ran without hesitation, without fear, like the sky itself had told her she belonged. Keanu smiled as he watched her. Talia followed a few steps behind, a water bottle in one hand, a slight grin tugging at her lips. She's been sprinting since the parking lot. Amara raced up to the bench and flopped into the grass, arms spread wide like wings. "I win," she said, catching her breath. Keanu leaned forward. "I don't think anyone else knew we were racing." "Doesn't matter," she said. "I still won." They all laughed. Talia sat down on the other end of the bench, next to the wooden wing, though she didn't touch it. She looked out across the field and was quiet for a while. "This is where he taught?" Keanu nodded. "This exact patch of ground." Talia closed her eyes for a moment. "It's strange. I feel like I can still hear his voice sometimes. Not what he said, just the sound of it." Keanu nodded again. "Some echoes don't leave." They sat in silence together. The wind, the trees, the sky, everything moved slowly, like the world was still listening. Eventually, Keanu stood and stepped a few feet forward. His eyes scanned the field, remembering. Calm girl in a yellow dress, one mother who refused to move, one man who remembered a name. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. That's all it took. That's all it took to change a company, honor a legacy, and lift the next generation. Talia looked up at him, her eyes glassy but steady. "You think it was really that simple?" "I think it always is," he replied, "but it takes someone brave enough to do it." Amara sat up and hugged her knees. "Can we come back here every year?" Talia reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "We will." Amara turned to Keanu. "Will you come too?" Keanu looked down at her, eyes soft. "If I'm able to, you bet I will." She smiled. Then she reached out and gently touched the wooden wing on the bench. "Did you make this?" "No," Keanu said. "A student in the fellowship program did. First graduating class. They carved it to honor your great-grandpa." Amara studied it for a moment. "It's perfect." Keanu nodded. "It is." They sat again for a while, watching the breeze move through the grass. At one point, a bird landed on the far corner of the bench, tilted its head as if it too was listening, then fluttered away. "You know," Keanu said quietly, "there are a lot of statues out there, a lot of plaques, buildings, museums. But I think this, right here, this moment, this space, is the most sacred thing I've ever stood in." Talia said nothing, but her hand moved slowly toward the carved wing, her fingers brushing it gently, then resting beside it. "There's power in remembering," she said, "but there's more power in passing it on." Keanu nodded. "And you've done that." Amaro stood suddenly and ran a few paces ahead, arms out like wings, spinning in a circle. "I'm flying, Grandpa," she shouted. "I'm flying!" Talia blinked against the sun, tears forming again, but this time not from sorrow. "She really believes it," she said. Keanu smiled. "She should. She's right." They gathered their things slowly. No one was in a rush to leave, but they knew they would return. As they walked away, Keanu looked back at the bench one more time. The wooden wing remained, a quiet symbol left for whoever came next. No words, just presence. This wasn't just a story about injustice, or flight, or war. It was a story about memory, about what we choose to lift, about the voices that echo across time, not because they shouted, but because they stood their ground. It was about a little girl in a yellow dress, a mother who said, "We're not moving," and a man who had every reason to stay quiet but chose not to. One act, one voice, one name remembered. That's how change begins. And it never ends there, because legacies, real legacies, don't land. They fly forward. They pass from hand to hand, from heart to heart, until someday someone we've never met walks through an airport, sees a photo on the wall, or reads a line in a book, and understands that courage, true courage, started in the aisle, not the spotlight. And because of that, they'll rise. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever met someone whose quiet courage changed everything? What story do you want to see next with Keanu Reeves? Leave a comment below. Let their memory live, and let this story fly.